Great evening, everyone. Welcome to our Monday Night Politics. My name is Megan Hayes Bell. I'm the Social Action Chair of the Washington, DC Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And we have a fantastic panel lined up for all of your questions and a great conversation for us this evening. We're going to get started with a welcome by our chapter president, Nicole Jordan. So if she is available.
Good evening, sorors. I'm checking to make sure I can be heard. So good evening, everyone. I am so excited for this evening. So good evening. On behalf of our over 500 members of the Washington, DC Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, we really want to welcome you to our first Barbara Powell Johnson Monday Night Politics of this sorority year. We developed our Monday Night Politics series in honor of one of our most civically engaged women in the district that we know, our beloved soror, Barbara Powell Johnson. And it's here to really engage the community in the necessary dialogue and political discourse. We are so excited to have you guests from all throughout the country with us tonight as we have this much needed discussion about our election 2022. As we all know, this is a very important election for us, not just as a country, but as a people. It is no longer enough for us to cast our own ballot, but it's necessary that we bring everyone in our community with us and get us engaged in this political process. So we are very hopeful that today that these discussions will lead to some informed political and social decisions that will positively impact your community and your family. We appreciate your attendance tonight, and for all of those who will be in the discussion, we ask that you participate. This is a conversation, so please join the discussion, put things in the chat, ask those questions, because we really want to make sure that we spend tonight asking the hard questions and having that hard conversation. In addition to our wonderful panelists, who I thank you for joining us today, we also have a Representative Janice Robinson from Red, White, and Blue, and that's a suburban women's organization that advocates against extremism in politics, who will be asking and providing some resources during our question and answer segment. So I really just want to thank you once again, because there's a lot of things that we could be doing on this Monday night, for joining us. I ask that you stay involved in this conversation, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. So thank you once again, and we appreciate you coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. And we're just going to get started. We're going to jump right into the conversation. Again, my name is Megan Hayes Bell, and I'm the chair of the Social Action Committee of the Washington, DC Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And I just wanted to bring greetings from the committee and my co-chairs, Janelle Henry and Celeria Moore, who are also with us this evening. And thank you all for participating in this very necessary conversation, as President Jordan mentioned. So before we get started, I want to introduce our wonderful moderator for the evening, Akosua Ali. She is the president of the NAACP Washington, DC branch, and serves on the NAACP National Board of Directors. As a nationally renowned champion for racial justice, President Ali leads the strategic implementation of diversity, equity, and civil rights advocacy in health, education, climate, environment, housing, criminal, political, and economic justice. Since 2010, Akosua Ali has led the NAACP in processing over 614 discrimination complaints addressing police misconduct, housing, education, and employment. Professionally, Akosua Ali yields over 18 years of leadership expertise across the federal government, nonprofit, and private sector organizations. Ms. Ali's career encompasses serving as a director of the United States Department of Homeland Security, managing a $7.8 billion IT acquisition portfolio and a $603 million budget. The United States Census Bureau implementing a $319 million communications campaign, reaching audiences in 28 different languages. She's also involved in budget management at the Federal Aviation Administration and the legislative support for the Rhode Island Secretary of State. And she is here tonight with all of those accomplishments under her belt. We are just so grateful to have her. She is a graduate of the Johnson & Wales University with a bachelor's and an MBA in global business and organizational leadership. She is a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, initiated through the Lambda Iota chapter in 2003. Akosua Ali is a Washington, DC native who currently resides east of the river in Ward 8 and Ward 7 I'm a proud Ward 8 resident, with her husband, Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali. Akosua Ali is a fierce advocate for women empowerment to advance gender equity as a civil right. And I'm so happy to again introduce you to our amazing, talented, brilliant moderator, my soror, Akosua Ali. So thank you for taking on this event.
Good evening, sorors, and good evening. Thank you so much. Read the full bio, so thank you for that. But as always, I'm honored to be among my devastating divas, my sorors of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and to our guests that have joined us for this empowering conversation. I'm really honored to be here this evening. So as we really set the stage for tonight's discussion, I want to center us on the importance of this conversation about the importance of voting. And we're often preaching to the choir when we have these conversations, but it's always important to really state it for the record that voting is our power. Voting, voter education, voter mobilization, and civic engagement to hold elected officials accountable in delivering on an agenda that advances equality and justice for the Black community is necessary. And most importantly, your vote matters. So when we talk about the issues that are facing our community, brothers and sisters, it's important that we understand we are in a fight for our lives, and none of us are truly free until all of us are free. And the question tonight is, are we really free when Black lives are not truly valued in all spaces? Historically, Blacks have had to fight for equality in all spaces, and today, your vote is your power to ensure that when we fight, we win. Because we don't fight to lose. When we enter into the boxing ring and you're geared up, you want to ensure that the liberation of our people being at stake, that we are set up and equipped to be successful in this battle. So our vote is critical in that journey. So leveraging our voting power is key to enacting legislation and policies that will impact economic, public health, education, climate, environment, nutrition, food access, policing, criminal justice, and public safety. This is not a time to be quiet. And my sorors of Delta Sigma Theta, we know that our organization was born and birthed by women who believed in the importance of fighting for our families, fighting for equality, fighting for justice. So I know the shoulders on which we stand. And we are in our fight for our lives, but we stand on strong shoulders, and we stand in a circle that is empowered to ensure that our communities are safe, healthy, and whole. So today, as we work to change tomorrow, as we work to address unemployment, underemployment, the Black wealth gap, healthcare access, environmental injustice, lack of affordable housing, gentrification, COVID-19 health disparities, maternal morbidity, and all of the other issues that are continuing to suppress the empowerment of Black communities, we are talking about civil rights and racial justice, which are all rooted in voter empowerment. So when we talk about voting rights, the importance of civic engagement, the importance of mobilizing our vote, it is all interconnected to ensuring that our communities are safe, healthy, and whole. Luke 4 shows us that God's work was always centered on ministering to the poor, advocating for the poor, and fighting for the vulnerable and underserved communities. So we can never separate ourselves and our privilege from those less fortunate. Their pain is our pain, and the economic devastation of poverty affects all people. So your vote, your fight is critical to secure victories in this fight to bridge generational wealth gaps in this movement from poverty and pain to Black liberation. So it is my honor to get ready to introduce our panel that will take us deeper in this conversation, because your voice and your vote matters. Civic engagement and political action matters, and they are necessary to address the poverty and pain facing the Black community and Blacks all across this nation. It is now my honor, with all hearts and minds being set and ready to receive this empowering panel of dynamic women speakers this evening. I want to start by acknowledging the leadership of this chapter, the visionaries of the Washington, DC Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, for understanding that civic engagement is the key to empowerment and progress. So to our sister president, to our sister leaders, the Social Action Committee, and all of you that brought this to fruition to start this conversation, I want to recognize you and applaud you all for bringing us and convening us this evening. My fellow panelists that have joined us, Jacqueline Manning, ANC 5C04, and Dr. Niambi M Carter, Associate Professor in the School of Social Policy at the University of Maryland. To first introduce Commissioner Manning. Commissioner Manning has 14 years as a commissioner in Ward 5. She is the former chair to Commission 5B in the last redistricting and is currently chair of 5C. She is a native Washington, DC Washingtonian, a product of DC Performing Arts High School, where she studied dance and theater. Commissioner Manning was the first ANC to challenge and introduce the mayor to community walkthroughs to show what was not getting done by city agencies. She helped spearhead the changes and redevelopment in Ivy City and New York Avenue at Bladensburg Road. Commissioner Manning is known as that girl among the community because she is of the community. She is that girl in our community because she has stood up and fought against those who did not put the community first. Commissioner Manning was initiated into the Washington, DC Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated in 2020. So Sora, welcome, welcome, welcome. If it is my opportunity to greet you this evening and welcome you to this empowering discussion. So thank you for joining us, Commissioner and Sora Jacqueline Manning. Next, it is my honor and privilege to introduce another distinguished, very knowledgeable, powerful Black woman, Dr. Niambi M Carter, who is an associate professor in the School of Social Policy at University of Maryland. She is the author and award-winning text. She is the author of the award-winning text, American While Black, African Americans, Immigration, and the Limits of Citizenship. Her research examines the public opinion and political behavior of African Americans with a particular emphasis on immigration. Her next book examines U.S. Haitian refugee policy from the Carter administration to the Biden administration. A former Woodrow Wilson Center Fellow, Dr. Carter is a recipient of an NSF grant as part of the Build and Broaden initiative. Her work has appeared in a number of outlets such as the Du Bois Review, Politics, Groups, and Identities, and the National Review of Black Politics. Please join me in welcoming these amazing, 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 powerful women leaders to begin this conversation about the importance of voting.
Thank you for that very lovely introduction. I hope I can live up to it.
Absolutely, we are women who stand in our power. So we always do what we are meant to do. So that will be what happens tonight. So I thank you all for your power, for your talents, and what you all stand for and what you all fight for within our community. We want to begin with our first question, and this goes to both of our speakers this evening. What do you view as the three most important issues voters are concerned about in the 2020 mid-year elections? Let's start with Commissioner Jacqueline Manning.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Yeah. So thank you for having me, first of all. I believe the voters and what I continue to hear, do I really matter? How will the selection of candidates and why is the mid-year not always publicly engaged? People are not knowing the time of it coming. And so trying to educate them saying, you know, because most people show up for the presidential election and not necessarily the midterm, but explaining to them this midterm is very important because there's things on the ballot that you may overlook that are really important that target into your communities.
And I would just follow that to say, I mean, there are issues and then there are issues, right? So I think Commissioner Manning talked about some of those real existential issues that people have, questions that people have about elections, like, why does it matter? Not, I mean, some of it is about civic education, but it's also the way I think we talk about elections. We often talk about the national stuff, the presidential stuff, but we don't talk about our local and state elections, which are less sexy, but nonetheless super important. But in terms of like the things that I think might make people show up, right? So I think the things that make people stay home or at least feel like this doesn't matter are a little bit different, but the issues that do seem to be arousing people right now, particularly our community and particularly women in our community, reproductive rights, right? I mean, I think we all know all over this country, women's reproductive rights are on the ballot. And when we know of Black women, that means our health choices, our health options are even more imperiled. And we already have a hard time navigating motherhood and all that other stuff. So reproductive rights, cost of living, right, is also something that many of us are thinking about. We're thinking about the cost of our groceries, the cost of gas, the cost of homes, right? I mean, home ownership as a link to wealth generation, as you talked about in your opening, is that attainable in many metros around this region, around this country? It's not, right? And then the other, I would say, is crime and violence in our communities. I mean, I think those are perennial issues. Again, and when we probably disaggregate that violence, it's not just that people are worried about guns shooting them, it's like domestic partners and other kinds of violence that our communities experience and that women in our communities experience at disproportionate levels.
Absolutely. And with that point, I want to go a little bit deeper in this question because you raised why people do not vote. And then we also connected it to income inequalities, poverty, homelessness. And it is a real question of how do you mobilize voters who are experiencing poverty and pain and do not know where their next paycheck will come from, where their next meal will come from. And the argument from many individuals experiencing financial hardship is, what difference will my vote make on either of these elected officials? How are they going to impact my bottom line? So my question for you all, and this is really understanding the scope of poverty in this country. We have over 140 million people who are living in poverty, poor or low wealth in this country. 43% of all adults in this country are living in poverty. 69% of Black people in this country are living in poverty. And before COVID-19, 700 people a day were dying from poverty. So when we look at the impact of poverty, the state of poverty, my question to you all is, how do we motivate and mobilize voters, particularly Black voters who are experiencing poverty, low income, low wealth, underemployment, and even housing insecurity, to be engaged in this process? Because 69% of people Black people in this country, if they're living in poverty, 69% of Black people is still a significant voting bloc. So how do we make voting relevant to this demographic of people that are experiencing poverty and pain?
If I may ask that question, I feel that going to where they are and not giving them more resources and educating them. We have to, education cannot stop. And that's something that I've learned seeing in the community, that people are so disengaged. Those who are engaged are not taking it to the masses of people who are not engaged and educating them on them. Our education system has changed where in government, they did talk about voting rights. Those things that we learned, some of us learned beforehand, that has been taken out the history, our quality of lifestyles, our community has totally changed, educating them, making sure they have to understand the importance of health, what's important to, because health is so important. That's the only, if you're healthy, you're going to learn better. Our schools are the example of where they've taken out, they're masking us down, masking everything over in the community and not pulling those roots out so we can have a wider audience. We have to go to them. We can't stop going to them. We have to pull the seniors that are well educated with the younger people, bring them back together in some sense of where we're on a leveling ground to educate them and to make it important to them to know, if you leave your state, make sure you register again in another state if you're going to live there for 5 years or more, to register to vote, because you do matter. Because at that point, you're a resident of that state. Wherever you are, what's important to you. And if you have a low income situation, make the government work for you. If it's not working for you, speak up, because everybody else is going to speak up in their culture. Our culture, we have stopped speaking up, and we have to figure out why. We know why, because they feel like they're not being reached or touched. We have to go back and pull one person back up, making sure the government is working for our communities, and we know that they're not. And we have to hold them accountable to that.
And I will also add too, time is a resource that I don't think we think enough about. I think we think about money, we think about knowledge. As Commissioner Manning rightly points out, knowledge is super important, because people who don't know anything or feel overwhelmed and intimidated are less likely to engage again, particularly if they're not getting assistance. But, one of the things that I think happens to our community members, our friends, our family members who are experiencing these instabilities is it eats away at your time. And voting takes time. You have to register in advance. Sometimes if you are going to get an absentee ballot, you have to request it in advance by a deadline. You have to go to a place on designated days at designated times that often conflict and overlap with people's work schedules or their childcare schedules. There are all of these things that make voting more difficult for people. So I think part of that is stuff that we can think about doing as removing some of those barriers to people's engagement, because a lot of it is built to frustrate, and it's supposed to frustrate people like you're talking about. And I think about something that Jesse Jackson said when he ran for president back in '84, and he talked about, Ronald Reagan won by the margin of despair, that there were all of these people who could have been motivated and activated and engaged, but nobody ever talked to them. Nobody ever registered them. And that's one of the great things of Jesse Jackson's legacy, right? He registered all these new Black folks who had not been registered before. But it wasn't just Black folks, it was poor whites, it was Latinos, it was indigenous people, it's all kinds of folks. So I think about that when your question comes up again, we're talking about people are winning elections based on the exclusion of the most marginal people and the people who most need the government to function properly. So while we're thinking about that civic education piece, I think is absolutely key, because I remember we had to take a civics exam to graduate from high school. You don't have to do that anymore. So civic education is something we failed on. But the other thing is we've not shown people how this is connected to their life. And it doesn't have to be big things. It's those housing services you want, right? The lights on your street that you care about, the trash pickup in your communities. It's the roads you ride. And if they're bumpy or they're smooth, it's the bus schedule and the metro schedule that so many of us are being held hostage by, right? All of this has to do with the government. And I think when we think about the communities we want to have, we can't always see the government as separate from us. We have to really take ownership of it. And if we don't like it, who's there? Being a neighborhood commissioner is a very attainable goal. And I'm not suggesting that people need to add this onto their plate, but it is certainly a way for people to be involved and empowered and think about making choices that really do influence their community. There are school boards. There are all kinds of ways in which we can be involved that are not monetary, that don't require a big commitment of money. They do require some time for sure, but I think we talk about it as if you have to have some requisite knowledge. Sometimes just knowing your own community is enough to say that I am able to participate and I am able to be involved. And I think that's one of the shield games we run on low wealth communities in this country is eating up their time so that they can't think about other things. And one last thing I will say, for people who are experiencing housing instability and who are maybe unhoused at the moment, we should not be tying voting registration to people's addresses. We can do it differently.
Absolutely. Preach, tell the truth, sisters. Yes, yes, yes. So the major takeaways here in particular, if we are trying to ensure that voter participation within our low wealth or marginalized communities, particularly those that are experiencing poverty or underemployment, it also requires that those individuals that are looking to implement an agenda that will have a direct impact on their livelihood and their outcomes have to be intentional in their messaging and in their marketing to make it simple and connected to them, connected to their income, to their bus schedule, to their services, how it will affect their children, how it will affect their public safety, and have different messages and different ways of marketing the impacts of what they will be able to accomplish and what the impact is of their vote. If that individual is elected, then that will have an impact on voter participation. Thank you so much for that, my sisters. The next question I want to ask you, Commissioner Soror Manning, what are you hearing from your constituents that are some of the most important issues to them in this city? You're on mute, my love.
I am so sorry. I'm trying to turn one volume up and another one. I do apologize. I hear a lot. And the main focuses are schools, the quality of schools, life issues, safety, improving the city quality of services, a government and a city that works for the community. So it feels like the government and the city services are not working for the community. It's always having to be at a hearing or not understanding why you can't come out. Something as simple as DDOT, roads, better roads, or the quality of the schools, getting communication, just communicating with everyone. And just something as simple as a grocery store. A grocery store is so needed. That should be the first better resource in the community than having a used car lot, a fast food restaurant.
Absolutely. And when we talk about food insecurity and food deserts and access to quality foods, affordable foods, the cost of produce, that's a whole word in itself, okay? So
you look at the price of eggs now. It's eggs, basic eggs, milk, cereal.
And then take it a step further to actually look at the price of produce, lettuce, tomatoes, broccoli, kale. If you actually wanted to eat healthy, right? Even beyond those staples, we talk about the importance of health and wellness, that health is our wealth. And without a healthy people, we can't be successful in education, in schools, and jobs, in any sector if we do not build and fortify ourselves. But with inflation, the cost of groceries, a trip to the grocery store right now it has been, of course, for the last few months now, amazing to wonder how some individuals who are really struggling, low income and low wealth, can afford to purchase groceries for their family. So these are absolutely real issues, my sisters. Thank you for that. The next question I would like to direct to Dr. Carter. There have been a lot of reports in the media recently that focus on the midterm elections and shifting from inflation concerns and the cost of living, but also looking at anger and frustration over America's rights and freedom, particularly access to abortion, guns, and the ballot box. Do you believe these issues will inspire women to vote in high numbers?
I think they will. I think it's always a question of, when we say women, who are we talking about, right? Because all women are not the same. And so, I mean, one of the things we've known for a long time is white women tend to vote like white men. And we saw some change in that around this abortion issue in Kansas, for example, right, where it was really the turnout of women that rejected this more restrictive abortion measure. But I mean, it was also those same women who showed up for Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020. So we have to be honest about that. I do think it's a motivator for Black women as well. Again, when we look at our rates of mortality, when we think about the choices that we can have of our reproductive lives, this is critical. And when we think about women in rural communities and Southern communities, whose access to maternal care, to just gynecologic services, right? A lot of that is coming through these same clinics that might perform abortions that are now being shuttered or starved of resources and other kinds of things. So it's particularly, I think, going to push many women who might have been on the margins and thinking, I'm not sure, but it's certainly going to push them there. I mean, we think about it, over half of the eligible Black voters, there are 32 million, give or take, maybe closer to 33 million Black voters, 53% of them are Black women. So Black women are really election makers in a lot of spaces. So they're, I mean, in some ways get to define an agenda. Now, does that always get listened to? No, but certainly Black women have recognized that elections aren't just about the issues that they care about. I mean, they are fighting for their lives, right? To quote you earlier. And so we have to show up, because this has a range of outcomes possible. I mean, we saw what happened with guns, right? I mean, and we just saw Black folks slaughtered in a grocery store. Right. These are the kinds of things that are, I think, going to push people. So whether I have a gun or whether I want one or all that is beside the point when I think about the havoc that access to weapons can wreak in our communities. And I'm not, going to talk about that canard of Black on Black violence. I don't believe in that. I mean, the access to these high-powered weapons. And now you have a lot of states, including like Maryland, saying, we're just going to drop those requirements because the Supreme Court said that we have to, right? Because the Supreme Court said you don't need these restrictions. So I absolutely think that Black women are going to show up, and they're showing up for everybody. If they center themselves, then lots of people benefit because Black women are showing up on election day. So, and hopefully sooner, right? Doing early voting and other kinds of things to make sure that they are not cut out of the process.
Absolutely. And when we talk about reproductive justice in particular, I always want to acknowledge our soror, Melanie Campbell, who has been a leader, a fierce leader and activist in the space for voting rights and connecting it to reproductive rights. That voting rights equate to reproductive rights and reproductive justice. And particularly the Washington, DC Alumni Chapter and Federal City Alumni Chapters of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated have been very active in joining the Black women call to action mobilizations that have taken place at the Supreme Court multiple times over the course of this year, standing up for a woman's right to choose and standing up to elevate the fact that the reproductive justice issues that we are seeing and the rollbacks that are happening are a backlash, or shall we say a blacklash, of the last election. And we realize, right, what the impact of showing Black voting power and what that blacklash equates to. But on the flip side, rural white women or white women in general that did not see the impact of their votes, right? Who thought that, oh, Trump is not that bad, or whatever their reason was that they were not quite ready to see a woman president. We'll put that aside. This is the results of their vote. So when we talk about votes having consequences, their vote has consequences. So although reproductive justice is an issue that does disproportionately affect Black and brown women, this is something that white women and they take very personal when it comes to their bodies. And this is the time for them to step forward, for them to join us in a fight that we have been fighting for a very long time now. And hopefully, hand in hand, Black, brown, white sisters and brothers can come together and realize that reproductive justice is critical and voting rights equate to reproductive justice. So I thank you. I thank you, sisters, for sharing that as well. I do want to shift to our next question. And this is to Sora Manning. This is regarding voter turnout. So voter turnout is historically low in midterm elections. From your viewpoints, are voters engaged on the issues, and do you expect a high voter turnout here in the district?
To be honest, not really. And that's unfortunate, and be honest, because it's midterm, because we know that everybody, again, shows up for the higher turnout is for the presidential election. I expect the states will have a higher turnout than the local areas such as ours. It just, especially just looking at now at what we're voting on and getting everybody out. And I always tell everybody to flip that. If you get a paper voter's card, flip it over, because there's other information on the back of that impacts your community, and you get to see what initiatives that are out there new. So I just feel like we're at state, we have to get a control, especially if the Senate get control. And that's why it's so important now for people to get out and get out there. And I'm out there in the evening trying to educate younger people who just turned 18 and didn't miss the deadline to register to vote, so they can understand we cannot let the Senate get control, because that's going to be the problem for us.
Absolutely. So I want to go a little bit deeper on this, and this is regarding DC politics. When we talk about DC and voter turnout, we have seen historically, particularly the low voter turnout that we see in Ward 7 and Ward 8. I'm a Ward 7 resident, proud, east of the river, some of the fiercest and most active civically engaged residents are across not only within my ward, but across the Penn Branch and Hillcrest, communities, some of those areas. But Ward 7 encompasses, similar to Ward 8, right? You also see that there are certain communities in Ward 8 that have very high voter turnout, right? But the decisions of that small segment that vote influence and ultimately advocate for the greater majority. And what are your thoughts on DC elected officials that are not addressing the issues of the people because they do not feel as if they will vote and that their votes matter? And to go a bit deeper with that, if our politicians and elected officials do not see priority in people who are experiencing pain just because they do not vote, what does that mean about our elected officials and them really having the best interest of the whole community, including those that are the most vulnerable? What are your thoughts?
It's depressing, because people take time to listen to you. When you run for a seat, you run to represent all. If you did not get that population in Ward 8 or 7, you need to ask yourself, what do I need to do to get the attention of those residents in those wards? Both wards are beautiful. I consider myself northeast of the river because I'm in Ward 5, and Arboretum touches the Anacostia, and it's so important, and we're environmentally challenged. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, everyone matters in the city. You cannot run a campaign and say all 8 wards, or you're going different wards and you're just hitting different pockets because you know they vote. You need to see why you represent. If you're an at-large council member running, you represent all, and that's housing, that's anyone that's in a shelter, that's the streets and everybody. you have to communicate to them. And you will want to say, if you're going to any type of conference or anywhere, or a stranger come up to you on the street, that they identify, that you can identify with them and understand what their pain is in that community. There's no reason that you should have a low voters turnout in 7 and 8, which you don't, in certain areas of what they consider. But there's other areas, those wards are just as important as any other ward of going to 1, 2, and 3, and 4. So
Absolutely.
why not speak with it? And I think sometimes people are intimidated by those that they don't know or how to approach, and that's unfortunate.
Mhm. And ladies, let me ask you, this question is next for both of you, but it relates to the Black agenda on a national level and on a local level. So what are your thoughts on Black elected officials and how their performance and their work aligns with delivering on issues that are addressing the Black community? And that falls under a Black agenda umbrella. However, we know that the Black community is not a monolith. So there's never a singular Black agenda, but there are some common denominators of issues that are disproportionately impacting our most marginalized Black and Brown communities. What are your thoughts?
So you mean individual people?
Just at a high level, I mean, if you want to go specific, but at a high level, there is a expectation. So let's look at it this way. One, we know that very often the Democratic vote, the Democratic Party takes the Black community's vote for granted, right? That many African Americans vote along party lines, and that vote is often taken for granted. So when we look at the Democratic Party addressing issues that impact the Black community, it can fall short because in most cases, majority of African Americans are still known to historically vote a certain way, right? Which then creates a dynamic where the Black vote is taken for granted, because in reality, no one party is tied to any particular community or any issues. But then to take it a step further, we have Black elected officials who also get a bit of a pass, similar to African Americans voting along party lines, African Americans also voting along race lines, if that is an option, regardless of whether those elected officials deliver by that community. So my question is, how do you all feel when the Black community votes, how we work to ensure that those elected officials are doing right by the Black community, whether they are Black elected officials or whether they are of a party that has consistently taken the Black vote for granted?
Well, I mean, I think it's hard because there's really, I mean, we're in a two-party dominant system, so there really isn't an alternative. I think for some Black folks, the Republican Party is an alternative, but I think if you look at recent memory, it isn't. In part because the Republican Party has sort of given up that line to white supremacist fascist sympathizers, quite frankly. I mean, we can call it what we want to, but I don't think you see what we saw on January 6th by accident, right? This is something that this party has been working up to for quite a while, and has been doing for a very long time, right? And Nixon, and then of course, Goldwater and others take it, which is, we're going to give up Black people, we're going to give up Jewish people, we're going to let the Democrats have them because we can win elections with white Southerners. And that's the strategy, and that's been the strategy. Now we see the strategy on steroids, and I don't know how you dial it back if you're the Republican Party, quite frankly. In terms of the Democrats taking Black voters for granted, I mean, I think that's the nature of parties. Parties get to structure our elections, they get to structure the primaries, they get to decide who gets on ballots, they get to do all of that. So they have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. And even though I think, if the Democrats, it seems like they're starting to wise up and think, oh, we need to actually get busy on voting rights because, what did everybody say? The Voting Rights Act is going to be there. And then what do we see in 2013? Shelby County v. Holder, and then it's open season on the Voting Rights Act, right? And now we see all these voter ID laws, all this voter suppression stuff everywhere from Georgia to, Indiana, right? It's everywhere. And now this issue that people have been talking about for a really long time, now there's all this energy to try to pull back the tide, but it's sort of like you had moments when you could have pursued voting rights and you didn't because you thought, oh, this is settled law, until it wasn't. And now you have people like Representative Sewell, Barbara Lee, Sheila Jackson Lee out of Texas and California, opposite direction, working on these issues. John Lewis up until his death. I mean, there are lots of folks who've been doing it. And I don't know that we give Black folks a pass per se, but I do think we have to be aware, and I think we are sometimes sensitive to the pressures that Black elected officials face. If they go too hard in the paint for Black folks, then we know their white constituents, depending on where they're coming from, are not going to be supportive. If they're, too mealy-mouthed, then their Black constituents aren't going to be supportive. And we also know that there's a ceiling on Black elected officials in some respects, because most Black elected officials come from majority minority districts. So we're only going to have so many anyway. So it's a really difficult dance with Black elected officials. I think at state and local levels, I think we have a lot more ability to hold people accountable in the ways that we want to, because those people live in your neighborhoods. They're in your communities. You can get to, the state house or your city council. You can go to those meetings and see people up close and personal in ways you can't when people are in the House or in the Senate. Because even though that's in the city, it feels like a lifetime away in a lot of respects. And you can't just walk up in there and talk to these people crazy the way many people would like to. So I think, the accountability part has to start early, and it has to start often. It is going to take resources and time. This is why organizations that do kind of watchdog stuff are really important. I mean, availing yourself of like their congressional websites is important. I know this again is taking resources, taking time. It's assuming everybody has access to the internet. All of that aside, right? You can go actually see what these people have gotten done. So if it's an issue you care about and this person promised that they were going to do something about the minimum wage, you can actually go see, did they do something about the minimum wage? Maybe it failed, but at least they tried. Sometimes that's good enough for you. You have to define what success is for you. But I think we also have to be real, on that point about what is success for Black elected officials. There are a lot of cross pressures. Congress is not made to move swiftly. This is why most things that we care about, whether it be voting rights, guns, you can run the gamut. Most of them die in committee, because we don't just introduce a bill and then it gets passed or not, right? Most of the time we say, oh, we're going to refer this to committee, and it goes to the committee and it dies and never sees the light of day, never gets a floor vote, right? And so we have to recognize that our legislators are not legislating alone. If they're in the Senate, they're one of 99 other people. If they're in the House, they're one of 435. And so it doesn't generally, that's not going to be the source of the fast changes that we want to see. We might actually have to think about state and local. We might have to think about the judicial process, which again is a windy, slow road. And I think sometimes, and maybe this is, to the early question why people are so dissuaded, we have been sold a Law and Order SVU version of politics, right? Where you get an issue, it gets solved in an hour and everything is all good. And we don't sometimes, even when we think about our own history, think about that these people fought for 100 years between 1865 and 1965 to get something that looked like the Voting Rights Act, to get the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. That's a century. So it doesn't, I think, comport with our mind sometimes that these things take a long time. You are in it for the long haul. This is a marathon, not a sprint. So when you talk about when Commissioner Manning was talking about holding people accountable, that is a day in, day out job. It's not something you just do on election time. It's not just something you do on, in the fall. You do that in the summer. You do that before the primary. This is why I get mad at people like Charlemagne and all these people who, armchair quarterback and talking about, yeah, these people don't get our vote, blah, blah, blah. Where were you in the primaries? Because that's the time when you start to get people to make promises, not after they'd have already won and they're about to go into the general. So it's this longer term commitment we have to have, not just to these elected officials and holding them accountable, but to each other, because that's a commitment to us about whether people are actually doing the things that we want to do. And sometimes even Black folks lose, right? I mean, look at Lacey out in Missouri, right? He lost to Cori Bush because he wasn't doing the job. It took a while, but he lost, right? I mean, eventually. So these people are not bulletproof. In this, I think, new cadre of Black politicos that we're seeing come to the fore are saying, we don't want to do it in the ways we've always done it. Just because you've been here 40 years does not make you special. And I do think that's an interesting bit of steam to pick up on, because I think these young people are getting energized, and I think they are starting to see how all the things they've experienced, a pandemic, economic downturn, home losses for their families, and generational wealth down the drain, cost of education, all that stuff is showing up in their lives, and I think in ways that we didn't expect. And I think these young people are really going to be that group that is savvy enough to do some of the work that we're talking about.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I wanted to pivot to you, Commissioner Manning, on what your thoughts are. So the complexity and the dichotomy of elected officials in Congress and on the Senate are it's a different dynamic that we have in DC when we talk about Black elected officials on the council, when we talk about a Black mayor. What are your thoughts about accountability for our Black elected officials in DC delivering on a Black agenda?
I don't think that Washingtonians, they do hold them accountable. I don't think they're saying, I'm gonna vote Black, because they're having these conversations beforehand. And we know that DC is so small that people know someone that knows someone that we're going to talk about. Well, let's have this conversation. We've gotten out of having conversations about who we're going to elect and what this person can bring to the table. What happens a lot of times in some of the elections, a lot of people run for these seats, then they walk away, you don't see them anymore. They're not doing the work. And that's the accountability that needs to have, because people are watching your every mood of what you're doing and your results in the city itself, down at the Wilson building, and what the mayor is doing. They're always having that conversation. I'm going to say we have our challenges, especially with different things, because they have a committee of whole, and who chairs what committee, housing, just getting to them and getting the information out. If you're not walking these streets and the civic associations are not having these meetings and people are not getting engaged, you can go to some community meeting, there may be over 100 people that are there. A lot of times you find the regular citizens, no one that has to be an elected official or a title, they're out here walking these streets trying to understand what's happening in these streets. Can you talk to me? And the first thing they would say, and they're concerned, they are concerned about who's running. If they don't know you, they will not vote for you. It's just as simple as that. And they're not, and now in a time where people lost lives during the pandemic and no one was able to get a hold of us, that's a problem. And if you weren't out there, people standing on the street crying, and we have new residents coming every day by the droves on buses. So where are they going to live? They need answers as well. How are we holding the city accountable of what's going to happen to the residents that are already here? Ward 5 used to be the ward where everybody came to talk about who they were going to vote for and put in that seat. Those things have changed tremendously because the dynamics of the community have changed. But we have to get back to that so people can be training their kids up to understand that. Because a lot of times we're not talking about it, we're not posting it up, we're not talking about the importance. I do believe that the younger generation is engaged, and at the tragedy of the pandemic, it has wakened, everybody has woke. It's more woke than before, that they're afraid to go to sleep because they're not sure if they're going to wake up the next day. But if we get out there and constantly use the media like we should, talking about the voting and not letting people know our history is so important to us. Everything is not an overnight success, and it's going to take blood, sweat, and tears, but we have to continue to talk about it. It's embedded in most of us on this tonight, and we need to make sure that our children are ingrained with that to understand. We come a long way, and we have to continue to fight. Our fight is never over.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Dr. Carter, my next question is for you. This is another shift since the beginning of the year, according to a Quinnipiac poll. the number of Americans who see our democracy is in danger, more than 2/3 of Americans say that they do, and the figure is even higher for women than for men. Do you think that this poll, which shows we have an overwhelming number of women who think that our democracy is in danger, will have an impact on the midterm elections?
I hope so. Because I mean, that Quinnipiac poll you cited, I mean, there have been others like it that are showing similar things. The democracy that we live in, I think sometimes we think of democracy as a thing, but it's an action, it's a verb. And so it is important that we remember that this thing only works if we participate and we enforce the limits and the boundaries and the rules of it. And so we're in a point right now where our elected officials have largely capitulated to breaking the rules of the game. In many instances, I mean, you even see people running for Secretary of States in Arizona, in Michigan, right, who are simply parroting the big lie. And if one of the core principles of a democracy is that the majority rules. So if you lose, I mean, the exception, of course, is the presidential, but if you lose by whatever the rule is, then you lose. And you move on, you bow out gracefully, you do the transition, everybody goes about their business. But when we're in a moment now that is like post facts, and people can just say, you stole something because I lost, that's the only evidence. And then you have lots of other people shaking their heads on, yeah, that's legitimate. And then you have people commit treason, because let's call it what it is, against the US government, right, attacking the Capitol, not to mention all of us who had to live under a curfew and all that. I was still living in DC at the time in Ward 5, under a curfew, who weren't sure who was staying in their neighborhoods because of Airbnbs. And I think that's a whole nother conversation, right? I mean, there was lots of stuff going on. I don't think people understood the level of frustration, terror, and just nonsense, right, that this majority-wide crowd brought to this city just because they didn't like the outcome of an election. And now you have people giving it credence, mainstream media outlets talking about this, real political candidates that are being funded who believe this, who will be the people that we would have to trust to ensure fair elections, to make sure that election results were certified, all of that stuff. These people are running. So while we talk about the Senate and the House, we have to also think about state legislatures, states, gubernatorial races in states. We have to think about state secretaries of state for the first time in a way that we haven't, because our democracy is in peril. And if people keep messing around, right, everybody always think there's another election, there will be another time. But if you look at scholars in international politics, international relations, they'll tell you this is how it starts. Chip away at the very institutions that you say you believe in. Just keep eroding public confidence in these institutions, and then tell people, and I can fix it if you just let me. And then we will see, we already see, right? People are more tolerant of fascist and autocratic, forms of leadership. So I don't think it's hyperbole to say that democracy is in peril. And if we don't do anything about it today, then we are going to be forced to do something about it tomorrow, but it might not then be a democracy that we can save in any way that we can appreciate right now.
Absolutely, tell the truth. Now, my last question for you all before I introduce another guest that we want to bring forward to share a word. It is regarding something that both national and local has a voting impact. So locally, we know that the real voting rights issue for the District of Columbia is statehood. DC has more than 700,000 residents that pay federal taxes and serve in the armed forces, but without statehood, we as DC residents cannot enact our own laws without congressional approval. Taxation without representation. We see it on license plates. Many of us in DC know what it means, but many citizens across the country do not fully understand what taxation without representation means. And statehood, as we know, is a matter of life or death for many DC residents. Without statehood, the people of DC do not have the right to pass our own laws without congressional approval. And we know that historically, Congress has vetoed many important DC laws impacting the lives of DC residents, from HIV and AIDS needles, many years ago, which contribute to the AIDS epidemic that we saw in DC, all the way to, reproductive rights and access to maternal care within the district. So we know that denying DC statehood it's detrimental. It is one of the most egregious examples of voter suppression that impacts the health, wellness, and livelihood of people in the District of Columbia. So the question that I have for you all is, what will change with the balance of power when the midterm elections? How will any change within the balance of power? What will that mean for women and families residing in the District of Columbia?
Unfortunately, I don't think much. I mean, to be quite frank, DC statehood has been fought tooth and nail for decades, right? I mean, it came up again under Trump because remember, he was threatening to deploy the National Guard and all this other stuff, right? And because DC doesn't have a governor, there's really no sovereignty, right, for DC. I mean, DC rules at the pleasure of Congress. I mean, we saw even this with a little dust up when Vincent Gray was the mayor, and he decided, like, we're going to go ahead and do this trash pickup and we're going to plow these streets regardless of whether there's a federal government lockdown, and they tried to come after the city for that. So I think this will be an ongoing argument, in part because Republicans, quite frankly, recognize that if DC becomes a state, they're going to get 2 senators like every place else, and those 2 senators will largely be Democrats. So I think that's what they don't want to see. And the fact that DC has, pays more in taxes than places like the Dakotas in Wyoming, right, is also, I think, a way for the city, if it became a state, to throw its weight around. So there is no, I think, desire for full congressional representation or full legislative representation or budgetary home rule. And I do think, this has been a 200-year fight for DC. And I think if the election plays out the way we think, which is the Republicans are likely to take the House, Democrats will retain control of the Senate, then it is unlikely that HR 51 is going to move much past where it has. And I'll also be quite frank, I think part of the long-standing issue with making DC a state is racism around the city and these notions that we have about this majority Black city, even though that's changed, and there are a number of reasons why, being able to run itself and being a real power player, and being able to sort of flex its own muscle relative to the federal government. And I don't think many want to see DC gain that level of power and independence.
Absolutely.
I feel like they're going to
Commissioner Manning.
Yeah, I feel like they're trying to push us out of the city, and then it'll happen. It's going to take another thing us out of the city like they're doing now. That's why everything is so high here that we'll never see it. I don't think it'll ever happen. I want it to happen. We need it because of the taxes. And so it's just like Dr. Carter said, it's not going to happen until they see an all-white DC, because they're intimidated by us. They're totally intimidated by the city and who lives here and the power of the people in the city.
I appreciate you all.
I
appreciate that, my sisters. That is very, very, very powerful for us to be able to bring it home on how the national scale of politics impacts us here in DC. And many of us know that this country has had a long history of political manipulation intended to ensure that power is centralized for white men, right? And limited power for anyone else, particularly Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. And statehood is simply an example of that. So I thank you all, my sisters. We are going to turn it to take some questions from the audience momentarily, but I would like to introduce a guest that has joined us this evening. And this is Ms. Janice Robinson, NC Program Director for Red, Wine, and Blue. This is a a sisterhood working to change the world together, one suburb at a time. Red, Wine, and Blue provides everything women need to successfully organize in their communities and beyond. And she wants to share a little bit with us, particularly about some of the work that they are doing, which is rooted in voter empowerment, voter education, voter mobilization, ultimately civic engagement to empower our people. Sister Janice, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Ali, and it's an honor to be on with Dr. Carter and Commissioner Manning, and just thank you so much for allowing some time for me to talk about Red, Wine, and Blue. Let me first frame just the importance of there being kind of collaboration when it comes to getting out groups of voters. When we talk about what has happened with white women and Trump and the voting for Trump, after I call him Knucklehead was elected in 2016, there were some white women up in Ohio, in a very red district in Ohio. And I always kid them and say, once they got themselves up off the floor, when they realized that they were being attributed to Trump's win, well, they started meeting in their homes, in their living rooms, inviting their neighbors over, their women friends over having glasses of wine, and started talking about how they can change the world. And they started reaching out to others of their friends and suburban women friends across the Midwest. And they were instrumental in helping Biden win back Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, because he won that white women's vote. They started looking nationwide, and here in North Carolina, we're one of the most detrimental states this election cycle. Around the same time that they were doing that work, I had started organizing in my community out here in suburban Charlotte, and started organizing through my precinct as I learned about the precincts and organizing my precinct as a member of the Democratic Party. And we were able to pretty much turn red Valentine blue in 4 years. Now, one of the things that's important that we do at Red, Wine, and Blue, we are mobilizing, and I always say the diversity of suburban women, because the suburbs have been diversifying for the last 25 years. The media only thinks about white women when it comes to the suburbs. I've been in Valentine 12 years. We are mobilizing the diversity of suburban women around extremism. We are 501c3, C4, and a PAC. We are nonpartisan. And what has brought this over 500,000 women together so far is the fact that we do not appreciate this extremism. We don't appreciate what it's doing in terms of taking away our reproductive rights, trying to destroy our school systems, trying to decide, well, Black history should not be taught in the school system. The whole anti-CRT bull crap, discrimination against the LGBTQ students. Well, what has brought us all together, conservative women, progressive women, independent women, is the fact that we're fighting against this extremism. And how we're doing this, and in North Carolina, I became the director in North Carolina about a year ago. And now we have over 6,000 women in North Carolina who has joined out, who has connected with us. And we're using a way of getting out voters. It's called relational organizing, which is just friend-to-friend organizing. So we are recruiting women to commit to getting at minimum 10 of their contacts, families, friends, associates to the polls. And we have some tools that we have created and made available to help these women to track and get those women to the polls. I'll drop some links in the chat. And as a network of diverse women, we are going to be getting about 200,000 women across the nation. But here in North Carolina, we're going for 50,000 women. And so many, Megan, and I know some of the other women here on your call tonight has participated in some of our events that we're doing. And so we are going after bringing out these women. And I'm gonna tell you, these diverse women, whites, Black, Asian, Hispanic, you know, we're a bunch of pissed off women, and we are not going to sit by and let this stuff happen on our watch. And so we're
Amen.
mobilizing.
Thank you for that. Awesome, awesome. So we're excited to hear about your work. You mentioned that you were going to drop some information in the chat, correct, about some of the tools that you have implemented and that can be shared as best practices, right?
Right, yes.
Excellent. And if you have any of your organization information, we would love for you to drop it in the chat as well.
I sure will, I sure will. Can I tell you about just one? We have this tool called Rally. You can text 59868 to text the word rally to 59868 to pull up a tool, to download it. You don't need a password, and you can track your 10 people that you're going to be working on to get to the polls. And we have this, the voter files are connected to this tool, so you can actually kind of see, wow, let me see if my friend Susie has voted early or not. If she hasn't, let me go ahead and talk to her and make sure she gets out to vote. Because what's important is not just for us to get to the polls, we have got to get other people to the polls too.
Absolutely. That is the word right there. So I appreciate you for bringing it home for us full circle, because that is in essence what this is all about, is getting people turned out to the polls. So thank you so much, Sister Janice. We appreciate your work. We appreciate your tools, and ultimately, hand in hand, Black, Brown, Indigenous, white, all across the country, we will have an impact on this upcoming election. So we thank you for your work there.
Yeah, thank you.
We want to turn it back to our panel. We have some questions that we would like to get to from our members that are in the chat. And we want to acknowledge if we have any questions.
We do have a few.
Yes, I will turn it over to you, Sora Henry, if you want to call out.
Thank you. This has been such an amazing conversation. Thank you all for just participating in the chat. We do have a few questions that we'd like the panel to answer before we conclude tonight. So here is one from Ivy Barnett. It says, we must hold our elected officials accountable. Can we talk about after the vote and how we can hold our officials, local and national, accountable to the electorate?
Sure. Definitely by making sure you make an appointment to go to their office. They have that, they are beholden to the people. So their office, you should be able to make an appointment with their constituent service person to see if they're actually doing what they said they would. They give 5 points on what they're doing in the community or at large in the city. So that's so important. So yes, after the vote, you have to make sure you hold them accountable by talking to them, making sure that they're visible. Not just them visible, but that office is visible in your state, that they're doing what they said they was going to do. I say definitely make a call or visit that office.
And I would just say, to add on to that, and don't be afraid to pester these people. I mean, sometimes it may not be a call that gets you there. It might be 10, 15, 20. And don't be afraid to bring other people in, just like Janice just said, you know, like, bring in 10 people to go vote. You might need to bring in 10, 20 people to put pressure on this elected official. Also look at maybe some of the groups that are working around issues that you care about and see what they're doing. Maybe there's a way to get involved with them so that you all can be a force in that. And then, you know, the other thing is, I mean, you don't have to be constantly vigilant, but if this person said they were going to do X thing by X time, keep that on a calendar. Like, wait a minute, so-and-so promised us that we were going to have this minimum wage increase by January 2023. Well, look around on January 2023. May be their fault, may not be their fault, but if it hasn't even come as part of their conversation in their regular course of duty, then you need to pull that person by the collar and let them know whether you're pleased or displeased with their position and what's taking so long.
And what I would absolutely offer here, particularly in Washington, DC, when we talk about elected official accountability, not only must we demand our elected officials step up on what they committed to stand for and committed to advance while they're in office. And we also must mobilize boots to the ballot box. But more importantly, in between elections, we must advocate for legislation, policies, budget, funding, and programs to ensure that these areas from healthcare to education to economics to jobs and policing and public safety, that they are funded. So the work is done in the ground game. And as many of you all may know, the NAACP is the nation's oldest and largest civil rights organization. So for 113 years, the NAACP has been at the forefront of civic engagement, political action, and mobilization. So not only voter registration, but voter education and voter mobilization, but the ground game in between is where the work is done. So when we're in the District of Columbia, we're talking about putting boots to the ground and getting to the Wilson building. But even in this virtual space, majority of the budget hearings, performance oversight hearings, legislative hearings are held on Zoom. So you can jump on a hearing from your phone and be a part of the record. You can provide written testimony for the record, but quiet mouths do not get fed, right? We can advocate on behalf of those vulnerable communities, but it is important that particularly we as women of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and we as members of the NAACP and members of the community understand our power and understand that it is on us to mobilize and ensure that our elected officials know what is expected of them and know who is watching them. And if they do not deliver on their promises and do right by the community, we will vote them out of office. Next question.
And that's a word. Thank you.
That's the word right there. That's the word right there. Yes, ma'am.
We have another question from Crystal Lewis, and we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier about bringing a friend and making sure that they have a game plan as well. But here, Crystal writes in the chat, the national political climate has ushered in an unfortunate sentiment of social engagement fatigue among many would-be DC voters. What advice would you give us as we attempt to energize local friends and family who feel overwhelmed by never-ending news headlines about seemingly unchecked corruption on the national level?
Yeah, that's hard because those kinds of things actually do discourage people, right? Like sometimes going negative is like, oh, it helps you win an election, but it does make people feel like this is like everybody's the same, nobody's different, everybody's corrupt, and nobody cares about me. But the fatigue is real. And I think in part because we just have to do so much so often. So we just got out of an election in 2020. Here we are, we've been in yet another election cycle almost for 2 years, right? For at least a year and a half for most of us. It's tiring. There are different tiers of elections. There are other things to vote for. So we're talking about the Senate and the House, but I mean, you have district attorneys, you have legislative or maybe some city council seats if you're in DC, but you have, you know, judges, you have all kinds of stuff on the ballot, and it is overwhelming. But I would say one of the things that helps people, I think, counter the fatigue is, luckily, if you do the registration thing, it's a one-time deal, right? You register in your home state, wherever that is, and as long as you're there, right? Maybe you have to change your address or something like that, but pretty much it's done. Election day, because we live in places that have pretty open election systems, you know, the ballot box was really key. Like we talked about Ward 7 and 8 having depressed turnout, but that was really key in seeing turnout in those wards go up. The convenience of it was a difference maker. I mean, these are also places where, you know, people have been designated as low literacy. So we know that when people get in the voting booth by themselves, something like that, that can overwhelm too. So we can think about talking to people about this game plan on the days leading up to the election so that it feels like a smaller thing. And then I would also say, you know, to some people, like, turn off the TV sometimes, right? Because it can feel like an endless barrage of news. So if you watching Fox or you watch CNN or you watch MSNBC and you watch it all the time, they're just telling you the same thing over and over and over again. So find you a paper that you like. It doesn't have to be the Post or the New York Times or something. It can be DC's. It can be, you know, your city paper. There are local things that cover more of the things that might be more important to you. I know a lot of young people like Twitter. That's another place to kind of curate your feed, so that you can get the news that you want to hear, and the news that you need to hear, but not feel overwhelmed by, because you can cut it off, you know. So I think I think the fatigue is something that's built into the process. It's baked in on purpose, quite frankly. And I think, you know, I think we have to think about politics like we think about everybody else. People are people. People are going to, you know, scam. They're going to commit acts of graft and grift, no matter where they are. So sometimes when we think about politicians, I think we have this notion they got to be good and they're, you know, thoughtful and they're for the people. Some people are also scammers. Scammers with great vocabularies and people who have deep pockets who've seen them get there. And it's okay to acknowledge that, you know, politicians aren't always good. And I think some of that frustration comes from this idea that we have that politicians are always good or work for the good. And I know that's an idea we would like to have. We would love everybody to be like Commissioner Manning, but everybody isn't Commissioner Manning, right? So we just have to maybe give the politicians their proper due. They're people who do a job. That job happens to be public service. Some people gonna do it good, some people not gonna do it good. Some people's interests are yours, some people's interests are not. And I think that's another way to kind of make it feel more manageable, as opposed to feeling, because I think we just treat the government and politicians as people over there, as opposed to people like us. And they do the exact same things we do every day.
Well, I say, well, thank you for that compliment. I'm going to clone off some other Commissioner Jacqueline Manning, because the important thing is to train other people to be able to come into those seats and to understand what it takes. It's sweat equity. Advisory neighborhood commissioners don't get paid, nor do Civic Association president. You're not doing it for the money. You're doing it because you love where you live. That's the environment you're trying to save. But not only that, with the politicians are human just like pastors in the church. We have to humanize them to understand, make people understand they're humans. They're going to be heirs. If we don't hold them accountable, they'll never know that they're doing wrong. And a lot of times people do things for a selfish gain. If I can get the center around me, I no longer have to worry about what's happening. I'm in this seat. No, you have to be accountable. That's what we're voting for you for. That's what you're saying this. Do that. Everything is not easy. It's a process, as we said before, but at the same time, we have to be able to communicate what is needed in our community. And if they're not listening, get another person. Put your eyes on them. It has to be at all times to know what's going on and what is not right with that person that's in that seat. Get another person. But we have to go back to the basics of having good old-fashioned community meetings. They work. Just sitting around the table and say, who's the next person we're looking at? Who's able to represent the community and stand up for me? Everyone is involved. Everyone is represented. And it's going to take a process for some of the things to get done. Everything is not going to get done in a day, but we can check the boxes of what has not been done and what that person said they were going to do. Hold them accountable.
That is the word right there. Do we have any more questions in the chat, Sorrel Henry?
There are no more questions in the chat, but democracy is definitely in action in the chat. There are lots of tips and guidelines and things that we could do in our communities to really mobilize each other before this vote takes place. So thank you everyone for really participating in the chat and giving some really great ideas.
Absolutely. And we have one last and final closing question for our panelists, our final panelists with closing remarks. On November 8th, Election Day, how can voters be game day ready?
Get some
So,
sleep the day before. Oh, I'm sorry.
oh yeah, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
Get some sleep the day before. Go back and look at all of the candidates, the issues that are on that ballot.
Mhm.
Make sure you understand what they are, what initiatives they are, who's running for what. Pick the best candidate that you know. If you have to call someone and say, I'm not sure,
Mhm.
especially like the at-large. Everybody get confused on the at-large. You get to vote for two. There's going to be a Democrat, a Republican, and an independent. And you pick that person that you know they have done some work, and those that are not holding people out here. We had a major unemployment issue out here where people are not getting paid their unemployment issues. Department of Employment Services. I'm using that as an example.
Mhm.
All I'm saying is look at people who have done well with these agencies on there as chairing these committees over these agencies. Housing, economics,
Mhm.
schools. Make sure you talk to your neighbors or someone that has been paying attention to the District of Columbia, because you'll be surprised at how many people live outside of the District of Columbia paying attention to our government and our welfare. And that is so important, because they will have an answer for you that can also help you be that game changer at that voting.
Mhm. And
Absolutely.
I would echo everything that Commissioner Manning said. Knowing what's on the ballot, knows who's on the ballot. I will also say, know your polling place, know where it is, know whether you need an ID or not. Beforehand, if you're in a state, not DC, or and DC, know your ward. But if you're in Maryland or Virginia, know your district, right? So you have a congressional district, right? The senators run at large anyway, so that won't matter. But you need to know your legislative district, because there are also state races on the ballot. Your circuit court judge, all of those are different. So they're not always the same number. So you might be District 47 here, but it might be District 4 elsewhere. So just kind of know, what your electoral district is, or your electoral districts are. And then I will just say too, think about what modality you can engage. So if you want to do online voting or, an absentee ballot, how far in advance did you need to request that? If you haven't done it already, are you too late? In many cases, you might be too late because we're too close to the election in most cases. Most places you have to do it 30 days. So if you haven't requested, you got to show up in person, for example. So if you have to show up in person, what are the dates for the polling place? Do they have early voting? That kind of stuff will help you prepare. I will also say, have a snack, have some water on hand, because if you're going to be there for a while, because that's something else that happens in our communities in places like Georgia, North Carolina, Texas, right? Is closing down polling places, so there are fewer places to vote, so it takes you longer. So just figure out what the lay of the land is in your community. And then lastly, what everybody said already, what Janice said, what others have said, make sure you ask at least 10 people whether they're going to vote. Encourage them to participate if they say no, and ask them what is their plan. Don't just tell people you should vote, you should vote. Tell them help them figure out what's on the ballot. Help them figure out who is on the ballot. And I think that will go a long way to making sure that you have a plan already, and double check your registration, particularly if you live in places that have a lot of voter repression and do things like purges of voter rolls. Check your voter registration.
Absolutely. So thank you to our amazing panel. This has been an extremely empowering conversation. In closing, your vote is your power. Your vote is your power. We have power. We, as all of you know, are proud descendants of some of the fiercest and strongest survivors that have been through over 400 years of slavery and oppression, and are still standing here on the shoulders of our ancestors as freedom fighters. We have ancestors who bled, sweat, for the right to vote. It is our requirement, it is our duty, it is our responsibility to ensure that we stand in our power and exercise our right to vote. So it has been my honor and pleasure to be joined by this amazing panel. On behalf of the NAACP Washington, DC branch, it was my honor to join you all this evening, and most importantly, as a distinguished member of the amazing Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, I'm honored to join my sorors and turn it over to the social action co-chair, the organizer, the visionary behind tonight's event, to close us out, Soror Janelle Henry. Soror, thank you so much for your time. Peace and power, my sisters.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. This was such a wonderful conversation, so informative, so timely. Thank you to all the panelists for participating and being part of this very, very important discussion. I took notes on my Post-it notes. I have voting is our power, your vote matters. Voting takes time, so plan accordingly. This system was built to frustrate us, so we have to do the work to unfrustrate it. Blacklash, democracy is a verb, and Black women are agenda makers. I am so, so proud and honored and excited that we had this conversation. We are preparing our communities one day at a time. We are doing the work, and I just applaud all of the efforts of everyone that's involved tonight. On behalf of the Washington, DC Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and on behalf of the Social Action Committee, we thank you all for joining us tonight. We thank you so much for being part of this very important conversation. Our fight is not over. Everything is leading up to the November 8th election. And so we talked about mobilizing the community, and that is what we're going to be doing. Saturday, November 5th, come walk with us in the community. We are hosting a community walk. We're meeting up at Howard University, and we're just going to talk to people and make sure that everyone has a game plan for November 8th. So thank you so much for attending. Please take a few minutes to complete our survey. It's in the chat right now. And have a great and safe evening, everyone. Thank you so much. Goodbye. Good night.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you, Deborah Jenkins, for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you also for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Good night.
Thank you.